The autumn wind carried the scent of pine and wood smoke across the rugged Montana territory as Eleanor Whitmore clutched her worn leather satchel against her chest. Her delicate Boston boots were already showing signs of wear from the treacherous mountain paths, and her once pristine traveling dress bore the dust and grime of 3 weeks on the frontier. She had come west, seeking her brother Thomas, who had disappeared into these unforgiving mountains 6 months ago while prospecting for gold. What she hadn't expected was to find herself utterly lost, with winter approaching and her supplies dwindling to nothing. The sound of rushing water drew her forward through the dense forest of towering pines and aspens, whose leaves had turned brilliant gold in the crisp mountain air. Her stomach cramped with hunger, and her lips were cracked from dehydration. She stumbled over a fallen log, catching herself against the rough bark of an ancient pine. And that's when she saw it. A small log cabin nestled in a clearing beside a crystal-clear stream, smoke curling lazily from its stone chimney. Relief flooded through her, followed immediately by apprehension. Out here in the wilderness, there was no telling what kind of man might inhabit such a remote dwelling. Stories of mountain men, trappers, and worse had filled her ears during her journey west. But desperation overrode caution, and she forced her trembling legs to carry her toward what might be salvation or doom. Before I continue with this incredible tale of survival and unexpected love in the untamed American, please let me know in the comments what city you're watching from. I love connecting with listeners from all over the world. As Eleanor approached the cabin, she could hear the rhythmic sound of an axe splitting wood somewhere behind the structure. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she climbed the 3 wooden steps to the covered porch. Noting the neat stacks of firewood, the well-maintained tools, and the general air of careful organization that spoke of a man who took pride in his solitary domain, she raised her fist to knock on the heavy wooden door. But before her knuckles could make contact, a deep voice rumbled from behind her. "You're a long way from civilization, miss." Eleanor spun around, her hand flying to her throat in alarm. Standing at the corner of the cabin was the largest man she had ever seen, easily 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders that seemed to span the width of the doorway. His dark hair hung past his shoulders, and a thick beard covered the lower half of his face. He wore buckskin pants and a wool shirt that stretched taut across his massive chest. In his hands, he held a double-bladed axe that looked like a toy in his enormous grip. But it was his eyes that captured her attention, pale blue like winter ice, studying her with an intensity that made her feel as though he could see straight through to her soul. There was something wild and untamed about him, something that spoke of years spent in the company of wolves and bears, rather than civilized society. I'm lost," she managed to whisper, her voice barely audible above the wind in the pines. "I've been walking for days. I have no food, no water." Her voice trailed off as those piercing blue eyes continued their assessment. The mountain man, for that's surely what he was, set his axe against the cabin wall and took a step closer. Eleanor instinctively backed against the door, her pulse racing, not just from fear, but from something else entirely, something she couldn't quite name. "Name's Caleb Stone," he said, his voice like gravel and honey. "And you're about as far from anywhere as a person can get." His gaze traveled over her bedraggled appearance, taking in her torn dress, her muddy boots, the desperate exhaustion written across her delicate features. "What's a Boston lady doing in my mountains?" Eleanor's eyes widened in surprise. "How did you know I was from Boston?" A ghost of a smile played at the corners of his mouth. "Your accent, your clothes, the way you hold yourself like you're afraid the wilderness might contaminate you." He gestured toward the door behind her. "Question is, what brought you all the way out here to get yourself killed?" The bluntness of his words, combined with the overwhelming relief of finding another human being after days of solitude and terror, broke something loose inside her. Tears she had been holding back for weeks began to flow freely down her cheeks. "My brother," she sobbed. "Thomas Whitmore, he came out here to prospect for gold and he stopped writing. His last letter was from a town called Silver Creek, but when I got there, no one had seen him in months. They said he'd headed up into the high country, but—" She wiped her nose with the back of her hand, a gesture that would have horrified her Boston finishing school instructors. "I hired a guide, but he abandoned me 3 days ago when our supplies ran low. Said I was more trouble than the money was worth." Caleb's expression darkened at this revelation. Bastard left a woman alone in the wilderness? The anger in his voice was palpable, and Eleanor found herself taking another small step backward. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I didn't mean to burden you with my troubles. If you could just point me toward the nearest town, I'll be on my way." Caleb studied her for a long moment, those ice-blue eyes seeming to weigh and measure her very soul. "Nearest town is Copper Falls, and it's a 4-day ride through country that'll kill you before you make it halfway. Winter's coming early this year. I can smell it in the air. You wouldn't last one night out there alone." Eleanor felt her last hope crumbling. "And what am I supposed to do?" "You're supposed to come inside before you freeze to death on my porch," Caleb said matter-of-factly. He moved past her to open the cabin door, and she caught his scent. Pine soap, wood smoke, and something essentially masculine that made her stomach flutter in a way that had nothing to do with hunger. The interior of the cabin was a revelation. Eleanor had expected something crude and primitive, but instead found herself in a space that was rustic yet comfortable, with hand-hewn furniture that spoke of considerable skill and care. A fire crackled merrily in the stone fireplace, casting dancing shadows across walls lined with books, more books than she would have expected to find in the entire territory, let alone in the home of a mountain man. "Sit," Caleb commanded, gesturing toward a chair near the fire. "You look ready to collapse." Eleanor sank gratefully into the chair, which was surprisingly comfortable despite its rough-hewn appearance. She watched as Caleb moved around the cabin with economical grace, ladling something that smelled heavenly from a pot hanging over the fire, slicing thick pieces of bread from a fresh loaf, pouring water from a pitcher into a tin cup. When he handed her the bowl of stew, their fingers brushed, and Eleanor felt a jolt of electricity shoot up her arm. She looked up to find him watching her with those penetrating blue eyes, and for a moment, the air between them seemed to crackle with tension. "Eat," he said softly. "We'll talk about your brother after you've gotten some food in you." The stew was the most delicious thing Eleanor had ever tasted, rich with venison and vegetables seasoned with herbs she couldn't identify. She tried to eat slowly, to maintain some semblance of ladylike behavior, but hunger won out, and she found herself devouring the meal with an enthusiasm that would have scandalized her Boston social circle. Caleb watched her eat with what might have been amusement, though it was hard to tell beneath that impressive beard. When she finally set down the empty bowl, he refilled it without being asked. "Better?" he asked. Eleanor nodded, suddenly aware of how she must look. Hair disheveled, dress torn and dirty, face streaked with tears and trail dust. I must look a fright. You look like a woman who's been through hell and lived to tell about it, Caleb said. That's not something to be ashamed of. There was something in his tone, something that suggested he spoke from experience, that made Eleanor study his face more carefully. Beneath the beard and the weathered skin, she could see that he was younger than she had first thought, perhaps only in his early 30s. But his eyes held the weight of someone who had seen far more than his years should account for. You said you'd help me find information about my brother, she said hesitantly. Caleb nodded, settling into the chair across from her. Thomas Whitmore, about your height, brown hair, soft hands like yours? Eleanor's heart leaped. You've seen him? He came through here about 4 months ago. Stayed the night, actually. Nice enough fellow, though green as grass when it came to mountain survival. Caleb's expression grew serious. He was heading up toward the old Mackenzie claim. Said he'd heard there was still gold to be found up there. The Mackenzie claim? Played out mine about 20 miles north of here, up in some of the most dangerous country in the territory. Avalanche zones, unstable ground, caves that go down so deep you can't see the bottom. Caleb leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. I told your brother it was a fool's errand, but he was determined. Said he had debts back east that needed paying. Eleanor's stomach clenched. She knew about Thomas's gambling debts, the reason he'd fled Boston in the first place. Their father had refused to pay them again, and Thomas had been facing some very unpleasant consequences from his creditors. Did he make it to the mine? Caleb's hesitation told her everything she needed to know. I don't know, he said finally. But I can tell you that no one's seen hide nor hair of him since he left here. And that country up there. It's not forgiving of mistakes. Eleanor felt tears threatening again, but she forced them back. She had come too far and endured too much to give up now. I have to know what happened to him. He's the only family I have left. Miss Whitmore, Caleb began. Eleanor, she corrected, and I know what you're going to say, that it's too dangerous, that I should go back to Boston and accept that he's gone. But I can't do that. I won't do that. Caleb studied her for a long moment, and Eleanor had the distinct impression that he was seeing something in her that surprised him. You're not what I expected when I first saw you on my porch. What did you expect? A pampered city girl who'd fall apart at the first sign of hardship? His pale eyes held hers. But you've been out here for weeks, alone, and you're still fighting. That takes a special kind of strength. Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks at the unexpected compliment. I'm not as fragile as I look. No, Caleb agreed, his voice dropping to a rumble that seemed to resonate in her chest. You're not. The way he was looking at her made Eleanor's pulse quicken. There was something predatory about his gaze, but not threatening. More like a wolf recognizing another predator, even if it came in unexpected packaging. The weather's turning, Caleb said, breaking the spell that had settled between them. Even if I was willing to take you up to the Mackenzie claim, which I'm not saying I am, we couldn't make the trip for at least a week, maybe 2. Then I'll wait, Eleanor said immediately. Here? The single word hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that made Eleanor's breath catch. The idea of staying here, alone with this dangerous, compelling man, should have terrified her. Instead, she found herself nodding. If you'll have me. Caleb's eyes darkened, and for a moment, Eleanor thought she saw something wild and hungry flash across his features. Miss Whitmore, Eleanor, I don't think you understand what you're asking. I understand perfectly, she said, though her voice trembled slightly. "I'm asking you to let me stay until the weather clears enough for us to search for my brother. And I'm telling you that might not be wise." Caleb stood abruptly, moving to the window to stare out at the darkening sky. "I've been alone up here for 3 years. I'm not good company for a lady." Eleanor rose as well, moving to stand behind him. She could see the tension in his broad shoulders, the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. What happened 3 years ago? Caleb's laugh was bitter. "You don't want to know." "Yes, I do." Eleanor surprised herself with her boldness, reaching out to touch his arm. Even through the wool of his shirt, she could feel the corded muscle beneath, the heat of his skin. "Please." He turned to face her, and the pain in his eyes made her breath catch. "I killed a man," he said simply. "Shot him down in the street in front of half the town of Copper Falls." Eleanor's hand remained on his arm, though she felt him tense beneath her touch. "Why?" "Because he was beating a woman to death, and the law wouldn't do anything about it because she was just a saloon girl, and he was the banker's son." Caleb's voice was flat, emotionless. "So I did what needed doing, and then I came up here where I couldn't hurt anyone else." "You saved her life." "I took a life. There's a difference." Eleanor studied his face, seeing the guilt and self-recrimination that had driven him into exile. "Is that what you think? That you're some kind of monster? Aren't I?" Caleb's smile was sharp and bitter. "I've been living like an animal up here, Eleanor, hunting, trapping, talking to no one but myself for months at a time. I'm not the kind of man a lady like you should be alone with." "Maybe I'm not the kind of lady you think I am," Eleanor said softly. Something shifted in Caleb's expression, a flicker of surprise followed by something that looked almost like hope. "What do you mean?" Eleanor took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "I mean that I've spent my entire life being the perfect Boston lady, saying the right things, wearing the right clothes, marrying the right man, or trying to anyway. And where has it gotten me? Alone, abandoned in the wilderness, with nothing but my own determination to keep me alive." She moved closer to him, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "You want to know what I think? I think you're the first real man I've ever met. Someone who does what's right regardless of the consequences, who lives by his own code instead of society's expectations." Caleb's hands came up to frame her face, his thumbs brushing across her cheekbones. "You don't know what you're saying." "I know exactly what I'm saying." Eleanor's voice was barely a whisper. "I'm saying that for the first time in my life, I'm not afraid of what people will think. I'm only afraid of one thing." "What's that?" "That you'll send me away before I have a chance to find out who I really am." For a long moment, they stood frozen in that tableau, the firelight dancing across their faces, the wind howling around the cabin like a living thing. Then Caleb's control seemed to snap, and he pulled her against him, his mouth crashing down on hers in a kiss that was anything but gentle. Eleanor had been kissed before, chaste, proper kisses from suitable Boston gentlemen who treated her like she was made of spun glass. This was nothing like those bloodless encounters. This was fire and hunger and desperation, a claiming that left her breathless and wanting more. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. Caleb rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed as if he were fighting some internal battle. "This is madness," he said roughly. "Then let's be mad together," Eleanor whispered. Caleb's eyes snapped open, and the heat in them made her knees weak. "You don't know what you're asking for." "Then show me." The challenge hung between them, and Eleanor could see the exact moment when Caleb's restraint finally crumbled. His hands tangled in her hair, pulling her mouth back to his, and this time she met his passion with her own, her arms winding around his neck as she pressed herself against the solid wall of his chest. When he lifted her in his arms, carrying her toward the bed in the corner of the cabin, Eleanor felt no fear, only a wild anticipation that made her blood sing. This was what she had been searching for without even knowing it. Not just her brother, but herself. The woman she was meant to be. As Caleb set her gently on the bed, his eyes never leaving hers, Eleanor realized that she had found something in these mountains that was worth more than all the gold in the territory. She had found a man who saw her not as a delicate flower to be protected, but as an equal, a partner, someone strong enough to stand beside him in this harsh and beautiful wilderness. The storm that had been building all day finally broke, sending rain lashing against the windows and wind howling down the chimney. But inside the cabin, wrapped in Caleb's arms as he worshipped her body with a reverence that brought tears to her eyes, Eleanor felt safer and more complete than she ever had in her life. Later, as they lay entwined before the dying fire, Caleb's fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder, Eleanor finally understood what it meant to be truly alive. The woman who had stumbled onto his porch that afternoon was gone, replaced by someone stronger, braver, more honest about her own desires and needs. "I still need to find Thomas," she said softly. Caleb's arm tightened around her. "I know, and I'll help you when the weather clears." But Eleanor, he tilted her chin up so she was looking at him. "You need to be prepared for what we might find up there." Eleanor nodded, though the thought of losing her brother forever made her chest tight with grief. "I know, but I have to try." "We'll try," Caleb corrected. "Together." The words sent a warm glow through Eleanor's chest. Together. It was a concept that had been foreign to her for so long, the idea that she didn't have to face the world's challenges alone. But here, in the arms of this mountain man who had shown her what it meant to be truly desired and cherished, she finally understood what it meant to belong to someone. As the storm raged outside and the fire crackled in the hearth, Eleanor drifted off to sleep, feeling more at peace than she had in years. Whatever tomorrow brought, whatever they found when they searched for Thomas, she would face it with Caleb at her side, and that made all the difference in the world. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with a dusting of snow on the peaks that served as a reminder that winter was indeed approaching fast. Eleanor woke to the smell of coffee and bacon, and the sight of Caleb moving around the cabin with quiet efficiency as he prepared breakfast. "Good morning," she said, suddenly shy in the light of day. Caleb turned to her with a smile that made her heart skip. "Morning, beautiful. Sleep well?" Eleanor stretched luxuriously, noting the way his eyes followed the movement. "Better than I have in months." "Good." Caleb brought her a cup of coffee, sitting on the edge of the bed beside her. "Because we need to talk about what comes next." Eleanor's stomach clenched with sudden anxiety. "Are you having second thoughts? About last night?" "Never." Caleb's hand found hers, his thumb stroking across her knuckles. "About taking you up to the Mackenzie claim? That's a different story." "Caleb, hear me out." His grip on her hand tightened. "That country up there is dangerous, even for experienced mountain men. Rock slides, avalanches, unstable mine shafts, not to mention the wildlife. Bears, mountain lions, wolves. And if your brother did have an accident up there, you think he's dead." Eleanor's voice was flat. Caleb sighed. "I think the odds aren't good." and I think you need to be prepared for that possibility." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, staring down at their joined hands. "He's all the family I have left," she said finally. "Our parents died in a carriage accident 2 years ago. Thomas's was my only connection to the life I used to have. And now?" Eleanor looked up at him, seeing the careful neutrality in his expression, the way he was trying not to influence her decision. "Now I have you." Something flashed in Caleb's eyes, relief, joy, possessiveness, before he schooled his features back to neutrality. "That's not a decision you should make lightly, Eleanor. I'm not an easy man to love." "Neither am I," Eleanor said with a small smile. "An easy woman to love. I mean, I'm stubborn, opinionated, and apparently prone to making impulsive decisions that scandalize proper society. Those are some of the things I love most about you," Caleb said, then froze as he realized what he'd just admitted. Eleanor's heart stopped, then began beating double time. "You love me." Caleb's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he might try to take the words back. Then his shoulders relaxed, and he brought her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her palm. "Yeah," he said simply. "I do. Probably have since the moment you stood up to me on my own porch. All 5 feet nothing of you, ready to take on the wilderness rather than give up on your brother." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. "I love you too," she whispered. "I know it's crazy, and too fast, and completely impractical, but I do." Caleb's smile was like the sun coming out from behind clouds. "Then we'll figure out the rest as we go." They spent the morning planning their expedition to the Mackenzie claim. Caleb showed Eleanor maps of the area, pointing out the various hazards and the safest routes through the treacherous terrain. He also began teaching her basic wilderness survival skills: how to read the weather, how to find shelter, how to signal for help if they became separated. "You're a quick learner," he said approvingly, as she successfully started a fire using flint and steel on her 3rd try. "I had a good teacher," Eleanor replied, then yelped as he pulled her into his arms for a thorough kiss. "Keep that up and we'll never make it out of this cabin," Caleb growled against her lips. "Would that be such a terrible thing?" Eleanor asked, only half joking. Caleb's expression grew serious. "You'd regret it eventually. Not knowing what happened to Thomas, not having closure. It would eat at you, and eventually it would eat at us." Eleanor knew he was right, much as she might wish otherwise. "How long before we can leave?" Caleb studied the sky through the window, noting the high, thin clouds that spoke of changing weather. 2 days, maybe 3. There's another storm coming, but it should blow through quickly. After that, we'll have a window of maybe a week before the real winter weather sets in. And if we don't find him in that time, then we come back here and wait for spring," Caleb said firmly. "I won't risk your life on a longer search, Eleanor. That's not negotiable." Eleanor wanted to argue, but she could see the implacable determination in his eyes. This was a man who had already lost too much to violence and tragedy. He wouldn't willingly risk losing her as well. "All right," she agreed. 1 week. The next 2 days passed in a blur of preparation and growing intimacy. Caleb outfitted Eleanor with proper mountain clothing. Wool pants that scandalized her, even as she admitted their practicality. Sturdy boots. A warm coat that had belonged to a trapper who'd traded it for supplies the previous winter. He taught her to shoot, both rifle and pistol, and was impressed by her natural accuracy. "You've got steady hands and a good eye," he said, after she'd put 3 shots in the center of a target at 50 yards. That's a rare combination. My father taught me, Eleanor said, surprised by the pang of grief that still accompanied thoughts of her parents. He said a lady should know how to defend herself, even if society preferred to pretend otherwise. Smart man. Eleanor smiled sadly. He would have liked you, I think. He always said he could judge a man's character by how he treated those who couldn't defend themselves. Caleb's expression darkened slightly, and Eleanor knew he was thinking of the incident that had driven him into exile. She reached out to touch his arm, offering comfort without words. On their last night before the expedition, they made love with a desperate intensity that spoke of all the fears neither wanted to voice. The possibility that they might not both return, that the mountains might claim one or both of them, hung unspoken between them. Whatever happens up there, Caleb said, as they lay tangled together afterward, I want you to know that these past few days have been the happiest of my life. Eleanor pressed a kiss to his chest, tasting the salt of his skin. Mine too. If something happens to me, nothing's going to happen to you, Eleanor said fiercely. But if it does, Caleb continued, I want you to promise me you'll go back to Copper Falls. Find the sheriff. Tell him what happened. He'll help you get back to Boston. I'm not going back to Boston, Eleanor said. Not ever. Caleb pulled back to look at her. Eleanor, I mean it, Caleb. That life, that woman, she doesn't exist anymore. You've shown me who I really am, and I can't go back to pretending to be someone else. Then what will you do? Eleanor smiled, her hand tracing the strong line of his jaw. I'll stay here, in your cabin, in your mountains. I'll learn to live the way you've taught me, and I'll wait for you to come back to me. And if I don't come back, then I'll mourn you for the rest of my life, but I'll still stay, because this is where I belong now, with you or in the place that made you who you are. Caleb's arms tightened around her, and she could feel the emotion radiating from him in waves. You're sure? I've never been more sure of anything in my life. They left at dawn, riding two of Caleb's horses up a narrow trail that wound through stands of aspen and pine toward the high country. Eleanor had never been much of a rider, but the mountain-bred horses were sure-footed and calm, and she found herself enjoying the rhythmic motion and the spectacular scenery that unfolded around them. The first day's ride took them through relatively easy terrain, following established trails and crossing streams on sturdy wooden bridges that spoke of regular maintenance by the few hardy souls who made their living in these remote areas. They made camp that night in a sheltered valley, and Caleb showed Eleanor how to set up a proper wilderness camp, complete with windbreaks and a fire pit designed to minimize smoke and light. Rule number 1 in the mountains, he said as they shared a simple meal of jerky and hardtack. Never let your guard down. The weather can change in minutes. Animals can attack without warning, and the terrain itself is constantly trying to kill you. You're trying to scare me, Eleanor accused. I'm trying to keep you alive, Caleb corrected. Fear is healthy up here. It keeps you alert, keeps you making smart decisions instead of careless ones. Eleanor nodded, understanding the wisdom in his words, even as she struggled with the constant low-level anxiety that had been her companion since they'd left the cabin. Every sound in the darkness beyond their fire made her jump. Every shadow seemed to hide potential threats. Caleb noticed her tension and moved to sit beside her, pulling her against his side. It gets easier, he said softly. The fear never goes away completely, but you learn to work with it instead of against it. How long did it take you to adjust to living up here? Caleb was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire. longer than it should have. I was so angry when I first came up here, so full of rage and guilt that I made stupid mistakes. Nearly got myself killed half a dozen times in the first year. What changed? I realized that dying wouldn't bring back the man I killed, and it wouldn't save the woman I was trying to protect. All it would do is waste the life I'd been given. Caleb's arm tightened around her. The mountains taught me that survival isn't just about staying alive. It's about finding reasons to want to stay alive. Eleanor tilted her head to look at him. And now? Now I have the best reason in the world, Caleb said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. They made love that night, under a canopy of stars so brilliant they seemed close enough to touch. And Eleanor marveled at how natural it felt to be here, in this wild place, with this dangerous and tender man. The woman she had been in Boston would never have believed she could find such contentment sleeping on the hard ground with only a bedroll and Caleb's body heat to keep her warm. The second day's ride was more challenging as they left the established trails behind and began climbing toward the high peaks where the Mackenzie Claim was located. The terrain grew increasingly treacherous, with loose scree slopes and narrow ledges that required careful navigation. Eleanor's horse stumbled once on a patch of loose rock, and for a heart-stopping moment, she thought they might both go tumbling down the mountainside. But the sturdy animal regained its footing, and they continued upward. There, Caleb said as they crested a ridge late in the afternoon. He pointed toward a narrow valley carved between two towering peaks. The Mackenzie Claim is in that valley, about 2 miles from here. Eleanor shaded her eyes against the setting sun, studying the forbidding landscape ahead. The valley looked like a wound in the earth, its sides scarred by rock slides and avalanches. At its head, she could see the dark mouth of what must be the mine entrance. "It looks," she began, then stopped, unable to find words for the sense of foreboding that settled over her like a cold blanket. "Dangerous," Caleb finished for her. "Yeah, it is." They made camp on the ridge, unwilling to descend into the valley in the fading light. As they settled in for the night, Eleanor found herself staring down at the mine entrance, wondering what they would find there in the morning. "Caleb," she said softly, "what if we do find him? What if he's—" "Then we'll deal with it," Caleb said firmly. "Together." Eleanor nodded, drawing comfort from his steady presence. Whatever tomorrow brought, she wouldn't face it alone. They descended into the valley at first light, moving slowly and carefully down the treacherous slope. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of their horses' hooves on stone, and the occasional rumble of distant rockfall. Eleanor found herself holding her breath as they approached the mine entrance, her heart hammering against her ribs. The entrance to the Mackenzie Claim was partially blocked by fallen rock, but there was still a gap large enough for a man to squeeze through. Caleb dismounted and approached the opening cautiously, his rifle ready. "Thomas," he called. "Thomas Whitmore, are you in there?" His voice echoed back from the depths of the mine, but there was no answer. Caleb turned back to Eleanor, his expression grim. "I'm going in," he said. "You stay here with the horses." "No," Eleanor said immediately, dismounting as well. "We do this together, remember?" Caleb looked like he wanted to argue, but something in her expression must have convinced him that it would be futile. "Stay close to me," he said finally. "And if I tell you to run, you run. No arguments." Eleanor nodded, though they both knew she had no intention of leaving him behind, regardless of what they found in the mine. The interior of the mine was a maze of tunnels and chambers carved from the living rock. Caleb had brought several torches, and their flickering light cast dancing shadows on the walls as they made their way deeper into the mountain. The air was cold and stale, heavy with the scent of damp earth and something else, something that made Eleanor's stomach clench with dread. They found Thomas in the third chamber they explored, at the bottom of a shaft that had been hidden by a thin layer of rotted planking. He had been dead for months, his body preserved by the cold, dry air of the mine. A broken lantern lay beside him, and it was clear that he had fallen through the covering and been unable to climb back out. Eleanor stared down at her brother's remains, feeling strangely numb. She had prepared herself for this possibility, but the reality of it was still a shock. Thomas looked so small and fragile, lying there in the darkness. Nothing like the larger-than-life figure who had dominated her childhood memories. "I'm sorry," Caleb said softly, his hand warm on her shoulder. Eleanor nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She had found her brother at last, but not in the way she had hoped. They buried Thomas on a hillside overlooking the valley, marking his grave with a cairn of stones that would withstand the mountain weather. Eleanor spoke a few words over the grave. Memories of their childhood together. Forgiveness for the choices that had led him to this lonely place. "He was trying to do the right thing," she said as they stood beside the grave in the fading afternoon light. "Trying to pay his debts, to make amends for his mistakes. He was brave," Caleb said. "It takes courage to come up here alone, even if it was foolish courage." Eleanor smiled through her tears. He would have liked that epitaph. Thomas always preferred to be thought brave rather than wise. They rode back toward Caleb's cabin in companionable silence, both lost in their own thoughts. Eleanor felt a strange sense of peace settling over her, as if a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying had finally been lifted from her shoulders. She had found Thomas, had given him a proper burial, had said goodbye. Now she could move forward with her life, her new life, with Caleb. As they crested the final ridge before the descent to the cabin, Eleanor turned in her saddle to look back at the high peaks one last time. Somewhere up there, Thomas was at rest, and she was free to become the woman she was meant to be. "No regrets?" Caleb asked, following her gaze. Eleanor considered the question seriously. 3 weeks ago, she had been Eleanor Whitmore of Boston, a proper lady with proper expectations and a proper future mapped out before her. Now she was simply Eleanor, a woman who had found love and purpose in the most unlikely place. "None," she said firmly, "not a single one." Caleb's smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. "Good, because I have plans for us, Eleanor Whitmore." "Oh? What kind of plans?" "The kind that involve you staying in my cabin, in my bed, for the rest of our lives," Caleb said, his voice rough with emotion. "If you'll have me." Eleanor's heart soared. "Is that a proposal, Mr. Stone?" "It's a promise," Caleb said. "A promise that I'll love you and protect you and cherish you for as long as I draw breath." "Then yes," Eleanor said, laughing through her tears. "Yes to all of it." As they rode down toward the cabin, toward their future together, Eleanor marveled at the twists of fate that had brought her to this moment. She had come west seeking her brother, and had found instead the other half of her soul. The mountains that had claimed Thomas had given her Caleb, and in losing her old life, she had gained something infinitely more precious. The autumn wind carried the scent of pine and wood smoke, and Eleanor breathed it in deeply, knowing that she was finally, truly home.